Welcome to Expressions of Leadership. I'm your host, Michele Kawamoto Perry. In every episode, we explore how people from educators and artists to executives and entrepreneurs lead with authenticity, rise through adversity, and share the wisdom they've gained along the way. An airport is more than gates and runways. It's a living, breathing system that connects people, cultures, and economies. My guest today, Daniel Kebede, has spent his career reimagining those systems, blending creativity, empathy, and strategy to design airports that work for everyone. Daniel is the co-founder of Abstract, a design firm reimagining airports as holistic, human-centered systems. From dreaming of designing airplanes to leading complex, years-long airport projects that serve millions of passengers, Daniel's story is about finding opportunity in complexity. Daniel, welcome to the show. I'm so glad you're here.
Thank you, Michele. Really appreciate the opportunity.
Now, Daniel, you've dedicated your career to designing and reimagining airports. What first sparked your interest in this very unique space?
I guess I could say I was literally born into it. My father was a commercial pilot for Ethiopian Airlines for 45 years. My mother was a flight attendant. And when I was born, my father was away on travel and at 30,000 feet. And this was a time when, air traffic controllers could actually patch directly to their pilots. So the first time my father heard my voice was on that radio communication at 30,000 feet. And I guess I've stuck with it since then.
Wow. And you originally thought that you would design airplanes, but architecture found you. What was the turning point?
Chance. I knew I've always loved aviation. I've always loved movement. I've always been fascinated by what aircraft and aviation in general represents. I grew up in Ethiopia, and there wasn't a lot of room in the university system when I was growing up. And so you were assigned. You were assigned what courses you would take and what career path you would take. And by chance, the combination of the aptitude exam for the architecture school and my GPA at the time led me to architecture. And, by that first semester, I was bitten. I loved it. And over time, I found that my two passions for motion and movement and aviation and architecture just found each other. And, now I find myself in that lucky opportunity to be practicing what I deeply care about.
And before starting Abstract, you worked in companies that basically wrote the playbook on airport design. What leadership lessons did you carry forward from that environment?
My first aviation career was at an office of a company called URS. And originally before that, it was Greiner Engineering. And Greiner was a really unique company. J.E. Greiner was the original designer of the Chesapeake Bay Bridge. They did railway stations across the world. So this really was an engineering company that over time had evolved and taken on more projects. And so me and my business partner, we met at URS, and we were very fortunate because the people who became our mentors were people that had been practicing airport planning and design for 40 years and more. They really had developed some of the original ideas about the relationship between aircraft and aprons and terminals. And again, I didn't know it at the time, but really we were learning the core fundamental skills of what it takes to create a balanced facility. So again, it was sort of chance, but it opened up opportunities for us that we are still drawing from, insights that we're still drawing from today.
And what was it that made you and your partner decide it's time for us to go on our own?
The more we worked on projects, the more we began to feel that, aviation is a very collaborative space. It takes a lot of companies and a lot of efforts to pull together these large, very complex projects. And we began sensing that there was an opportunity in the market for a specialized practice, a practice that devoted itself to aviation, but brought some of the skills that I think are unique to architecture. An architect is trained to be a generalist. We always joke that an architect knows something about everything, but to a limited depth. Whereas I think engineers, as an example, know a lot about a single topic, and so that combination of breadth and depth together is really what makes this work so interesting. And going back to your question of what did we learn, I think the core lesson we learned from the leadership that we were operating under is that our mentors always had the big picture. They didn't see an airport as one thing or one component. They really saw it as a whole system. And so, we were driven to understand not just the architecture part, but the engineering part, the civil engineering part, the environmental elements, and all the way down to the big picture planning or the fine details. And I think that sort of flexibility to look at the big picture, but also drill down and understand the implication of each detail. I think that was some of the core lessons we learned, and ultimately, I think still drives what we do today.
And why did you name your company Abstract? How does that reflect your leadership approach?
I think we probably spent more time on that question than anything else in developing Abstract. Um, what we ultimately settled on was an idea that when you're leading complex projects across multiple years, across multiple teams, you have to have ideas that are portable. You have to have ideas that you can carry through multiple iterations. You have to carry across time. And so the idea to distill down something to its essence, to its core essence, became fundamental to being successful on large projects. So in a way, the big things work when you figured out the one small thing that ties them all together. And so that process of distilling down to the fundamental essence of a problem is what became, our practice, and ultimately why we called it Abstract.
Now, at Abstract, you approach airports as holistic systems. Can you describe what are some of those elements that make up those holistic systems?
So if you think about it, when you get to an airport, there's really three things you care about: people, bags, and aircraft. I mean, that's really what makes airports unique. And what we focus on is how do you transition from one mode of transportation, so it can be a car, a bus, a train, to an aircraft. I mean, that's fundamentally what we do. And then it's the reverse journey when you return. But there's a lot of elements that go into that, from how do you bring in passengers, and how does the system recognize you? How do you separate the passenger and their bags? How do you screen the two separately, and then ultimately make sure that they end up on the same aircraft? So while the goal of the system is simple enough, the components and things that go into it is what makes it a complicated system. And so the importance of thinking of it holistically is that from a passenger's perspective, it has to feel like a seamless journey. It has to feel fluid. It has to feel continuous. Otherwise, when you have disruptions or the things are not tying together, that's when stress levels increase. People become frustrated. Operationally, you can't. You find it becomes difficult to be efficient. And so the idea of this holistic thinking is realizing that each component plays a part, but that part contributes to the whole, and the whole has to be balanced. So, if I take the analogy of an orchestra, each instrument, each piece has a role to play in the overall sort of cadence of that piece. It's a similar thing. So it's that ability to understand the contribution of each piece, but how that contribution has to be timed just right for the whole to make sense. So that's really the important. And an airport is a performative facility. We always say we're operationally minded first and foremost. So how does it work? How does it flow? And that's always the lesson we keep coming back to, and the questions we keep asking ourselves.
And so I hear you really saying this is about the human experience going through the airport. So you're really thinking about what is that like?
Absolutely.
Was there a moment when you were traveling yourself that you thought this could be done better and I'm going to help change this?
It's funny for me. I think the happiest place in the world for me is a window seat on a morning flight with the first cup of coffee. I just that I can't think of a better place. But part of that joy comes from understanding all that goes into making that moment possible. Thinking about all the inventions, all the rules, all the systems, everything that just had to work perfectly right for that moment to be possible. And it still amazes me on that takeoff, and you look down and you're like, oh my gosh, human beings are doing this, and we're doing this daily. I think we're doing 10,000 flights a day. That's incredible. But that technical component really is realized first and foremost as a human experience, right? It's that moment, that passenger in that seat, thinking about reaching a loved one, thinking about a desired destination, anxious because of a place they're going. I mean, ultimately, we travel for very human reasons, even though we've created these spectacular systems that now work so well that they're almost invisible to us. And I think that insight really drove mine and my partner Chris's desire to start Abstract, because we distilled it down to the realization that every decision we make in an airport ultimately has to come back to how does it affect the passenger's experience, whether it's the baggage handling system, whether it's the aircraft, whether it's the air traffic control tower. Like, all of those pieces ultimately come down to a very human, a very intuitive experience. And that's really the joy of it. It's finding that balance in the system, that right tone, that right feel, to say, now it's working well.
And was there anything specific that you felt you really needed to solve when you were experiencing it as a passenger?
For a passenger, stress is probably the thing that takes away the most from from the experience of traveling. And so we spend a lot of time really trying to identify where are the stress points. Going through security is never easy. As great as the TSA agents can be, as beautiful as the space can be, it's a stressful experience. But one of the things we found is if you create checkpoints that have higher ceilings, that have more natural daylight, that have views to the outside, there is a measurable decrease in stress levels, and it's tangible. Once you've come through the checkpoint, what you meet right at the end of the checkpoint actually matters. If you meet an area that's got beautiful views, comfortable seating so you can sit down and gather yourself, their signage and wayfinding is clear so you can orient yourself, it transforms the experience of even the checkpoint itself, versus if you went into sort of a confusing dark place where you don't know where you're going, then it exacerbates that anxiety that you already had. So the ability to understand the system's impact on a passenger's feeling, I think, is really essential. And the smoother you can make those transitions, the better the experience. And in the end, someone flying out feels like, that was great, that was good. Versus the opposite.
Well, we're going to take a short break. And when we come back, we'll dive into the rituals, stories, and empathy that drive Daniel's leadership style. Stay with us. We'd love for you to be a part of the Expressions of Leadership community. Follow us wherever you get your podcasts and connect with us on Instagram and YouTube at Expressions of Leadership. Welcome back to Expressions of Leadership. I'm Michele Kawamoto Perry, and our guest today is Daniel Kebede, and we've been talking about how his career took flight. Now I want to dig into the habits and human connections that keep his work and his team moving forward. Now, Daniel, you've mentioned that rituals make things intuitive. Can you share an example from your work or leadership life?
The one ritual that I feel so many times is underappreciated is actually the ritual that all of us know in an aircraft. life vest, the light, the tube. Every aircraft plays out that ritual. And, you know, it's so profound because it plays out in every country, in every language, in every aircraft, in exactly the same sequence. And what is really happening is flight attendants are first and foremost safety officers. That's why they're on the plane. They are safety officers. And so by going through these rituals, they are bringing it to your attention, right? Imagine you're putting 150 people into a pressurized aluminum tube and throwing them at 80% of the speed of sound. That's not natural. There is nothing in our evolution that prepared us for that. But this ritual normalizes it. Oh, I've seen this before. I know this. I got this. So that ritual aligns 150 people with, going to multiple, just as many different destinations into one cohesive whole. That's an incredibly powerful ritual. And even for those that keep their headphones on and don't look up and pay attention, that we've already been trained. So same as when you walk into a library, your voice, goes down. When you walk into a stadium, you tend to get louder. Like these are already built into us because we've associated rituals with those spaces. Same with an aircraft. That's what I mean by rituals are so powerful. Once you've associated habit with place, what happens is it becomes easier to align 150 people, 1,000 people into the same collective action and movement. And it didn't matter where they came from, what their background is. Those rituals basically tell us, okay, I am in this space and this is how I need to function. So, for your listeners, if there is one ask I would have is next time you're on a flight and the flight attendants start giving those instructions, put those headphones down, listen, participate with them. It's an incredible thing to be able to do that over and over on multiple flights. But I think this is one way where we get to participate, and we get to participate in a ritual that's practiced throughout the world in the exact same way. How many things are there that we can say that for?
And do you have an example of the rituals making things intuitive in leadership?
We formalized that into a process. So for us at Abstract, we actually call that PAX 360. And what PAX 360 represents for us is a disciplined way of aligning multiple stakeholders into one fold. And so the way we practice this is we go into a design problem. Everyone has different inputs. Everyone has different ideas. Everyone has different priorities. But the first thing we always ask is, what is the impact it has on the passenger? Right? Always asking that, what impact does it have on the passenger? Because then you mentally shift and you put yourself in that perspective. If I'm interested in giving them more concession opportunities, what does that mean for the passenger? If I want to create a baggage handling system that's more efficient, what does that mean for the passenger? And once you've got that common denominator, then you can start prioritizing different decisions, but you can prioritize them in one coherent framework. And then you say, this one has a bigger experience. This is also important, but right now in this particular situation, not as big as this one. And so the idea of establishing the passenger experience as a framework lets us always get out of our own heads, our own priorities, and settle into a reference frame that you can then compare to others around you. Well, this is important, yes, but what does it contribute to that? That is also important, but how much more important is this when we look at it through the passenger's lens? So it's a ritual in the sense that it's a disciplined approach of asking a very particular question to allow people to think in a specific way that then allows us to pull different stakeholders, different opinions, different voices together. And for us, this is fundamental.
Now, I want to switch over to storytelling. Because storytelling plays a big role in your leadership. Why do you believe it's so essential in making complex ideas stick?
I think humans, we've always been storytellers. And I think storytelling has had a very functional purpose. Humans have lived in very complicated environments and they didn't always know why something happened, but they knew it happened. So how do you remember? I think this is where myths and legends come from. They're less about transmitting fact and more about taking different pieces of information, complex information, and aligning it in a way that makes it memorable. I've always loved the idea of the, Aboriginal song lines. So, the story goes, Aboriginal song lines are, they would walk these paths and they would tell stories. But that was a way of remembering. And so our mind has an incredible capacity of remembering when it's put within the framework of a story because it connects pieces together in a way that says, oh, that's what it is. Oh, that's what it is. So putting it into the context of an airport project, you're talking about billions of dollars that you have to mobilize to do an airport, but yet all of it has to be synchronized and ultimately result in a coherent experience for a passenger. How do you make it all stick? How do you remember all of these moving pieces? And so for us, especially when you're doing stakeholder engagement, when you're doing client engagement, when you're trying to explain even at a community level why this project matters, that story becomes important. And it becomes a very portable way to carry very complicated decisions with you. You know, there's that great question, why should I care? So you have to think about for this audience, why should they care about this story? Why should they care and take interest in this particular decision? And so having a story allows you to sort of package up neatly all the things that matter, but in a way that makes it accessible to the broadest audience you can. And just the human mind is made for that. It's made for carrying complexity in this really unique format.
Mentoring is clearly important to you. How do you develop your staff to see problems and tell stories the way you do?
When Chris and I talked about abstract and what it meant to us, three things were very, very clear from the beginning. We wanted to do excellent work. We wanted to research, find better ways to do the stuff we love to do, and to teach. And teaching is, I think one of the great secrets about teaching is that the teacher learns more than the student every time. And so for us, what we saw in mentoring is our ability to teach reflected how well we understood our subjects. So teaching in many ways can't be separated from practice. And whether it's architecture, medicine, any of what I'd consider the practiced arts, you can't separate teaching. And so the ability to tell stories that we just talked about, that is profoundly important to how we work. And that story of why teaching is a part of how we work, again, feeds into that same cycle because we're reinforcing the message of what is it we're trying to achieve. If it's the passenger, well, the passenger matters because it affects how, we experience the places. And for our mentees, once they start understanding that, they then understand the kind of questions they should be asking, the kind of curiosities they should have, the kind of things they should pay attention to as they're walking around. So all these three things, even though we talk about them as separate pieces, doing good work, researching, and teaching, they really are all part of a single practice. And it's a reinforcing, positively reinforcing cycle when you've balanced it correctly. So that's why I think to me, mentoring is so important. It is at the core of the practice itself.
And what role does empathy play in your leadership, both for your team and for the passengers that your designs serve?
I think humility is important, and it's important not necessarily from the standpoint of being nice, although that's a good thing, right? But to me, both empathy and humility are about being open to possibilities that you can't see. I think both for me and Chris, are the happiest times we have in design is when we run into an idea that neither of us could have come up with on our own. Right? That idea of being surprised by what's possible, that idea of seeing beyond what your own sort of values and predispositions would have led you to, because you had enough empathy to listen clearly to someone else's intent, or that you are willing to put aside your own sort of predispositions on how a solution should evolve, to actually let the solution emerge because of this active listening. So empathy is important to me as a generative potential. This is where we can get the new ideas by paying attention to how are people using the space? How is someone else understanding this problem, right? It gives you another perspective. And I think its importance is not necessarily in sort of this kindness, although again, I think that's that kindness in itself has that power. It's creative potential. I think it has incredible creative potential.
Rituals, stories, humility, empathy. These are not just nice to have leadership traits, they're actually essentials. So after the break, we'll explore how Daniel helps his team navigate the unknown and align dozens of stakeholders on high stakes projects. Don't go anywhere. By partnering with Expressions of Leadership, you'll reach an audience of professionals passionate about leadership and growth. For sponsorship opportunities, please contact us at letstalk@expressionsofleadership.com. We're back on Expressions of Leadership. I'm your host, Michele Kawamoto Perry, here with Daniel Kebede, talking about leadership in one of the most complex design environments you can imagine, airports. Daniel, you've said as designers that we can't know the future for certain, but we can open ourselves up to possibilities. How do you help your team to do that?
The most difficult thing for any designer is not to jump to a solution before you've thought through things carefully. We're always tempted to start drawing, to start solving, to start answering before waiting. Waiting and really figure out, have I understood the problem? Have I asked all the right questions? And usually that comes with pressure. So anytime someone gives you a problem and, it's like, okay, you're a good architect. Here's my problem, solve it. And there's that desire. It's like, I have to solve it. I have to show something creative. But that really takes away from, I think, the power of just being comfortable with not knowing, just sitting with it. I always think internally, like confusion is not drama. Not knowing is not, it's actually a great state to be in. It's hard to go to a client and when they ask you a problem, say, well, I don't know. You want to say, well, I do know. But the truth is, like most of the time, we don't know, especially when it comes to complex systems such as airports. And so that ability to be comfortable with discomfort is absolutely important for any creative endeavor, whether it's art, architecture, design, and even creative engineering. And this is one of the core tenets I think that we try to enforce internally is take a moment. We always talk about sketching, drawing, freehand without the computer. It's just that ability to let your mind wander freely and, sort of occupy that space of potential. And then after that, slowly ask questions, ask good questions, interrogate the problem, talk to your clients, go and find out what's happened, research, do some background information. And there is a skill you can develop in asking better questions. I know people sometimes say there is no such thing as a stupid question. I don't think that's true. I think there is an art form to asking better questions, because the asking in itself opens up possibilities. And so, It's not just asking questions. Learn to ask better questions. Learn to ask smart questions. Learn to ask meaningful questions that actually let you develop more coherence, a deeper framework into understanding a problem. And if you've asked enough questions, enough good questions, things start emerging, potentials start emerging. And I can't explain how it happens, but it happens. You start making these connections, you start mapping out that space of possibility. And then, given that particular moment, if you see the strongest potential, you say, I think that's the right answer. I bet that's the right one. And then we convert into another model, which is as an architect, you have to communicate effectively. And so to me, this is the idea of speaking clearly, having good drawings, having good presentation material, like really showing not just that you understand the problem, but that you can navigate it in a meaningful way. So I think being comfortable with discomfort and letting, especially with complex problems, sitting with them for the right amount of time, learning how to ask better questions and how to do good research, but not just random research, but research that actually pushes sort of the boundaries of that possibility. And ultimately, once you've mapped the range of possibilities to say, this is the path, this is why it matters, here is the story, here's the visuals that accompany that story, and then driving forward the project, I think those are essential, very essential steps.
Well, we're a society that really likes to take action. So, how do you personally resist that urge to jump to conclusions and instead wait in that uncertainty that you were speaking of?
I think a lot of this is practice. Um, Patience, again, that's also a practice. Um, I think it's being anchored in your values, like what matters to you. Going back to this idea for us, the passenger is everything. Yes, you can say the guest, you can say but for me, it's really the passenger in a very specific way. And waiting till you understand what this means from their perspective. What is that experience? This is not to say that grand projects and big visions aren't important, but if we don't anchor them in our core values, then yes, we are just doing things and we're not driving towards something that ultimately is important. So I think part of that is to have spent enough time thinking what's our value, what's our priority, what are the things that we do not compromise. And I think that gives you sort of the confidence to settle down and wait because you know what it ultimately needs to look like. You're just trying to navigate a path or the most effective path to it.
Now, you lead projects with 30, 40 stakeholders, each with different priorities, and that can be rather daunting. How do you keep everyone aligned without losing momentum?
Trust. Trust is a big part of it. And trust, as you know, it's hard to earn, but it's even harder to recover if you've lost it. So making sure that we build up alignment carefully, thoughtfully, especially early on, is really important. Settling in on what are our core priorities. And by default, for us, that's the passenger. And every stakeholder, whether it's the fire marshal, the airlines, the airport, the concessionaire, TSA, the contractor, like all of us, we have different priorities for good reasons. But all of us come together in this one common denominator that's the passenger. And I think once you take that and you build that as the denominator, then the next step is making sure you've communicated to each stakeholder that you understand their perspective. And, on airport projects, that doesn't happen overnight. We've had the good fortune on a lot of the airports that we've worked on that we've done smaller projects there before. We've interacted with a lot of the same stakeholders. And so you're building up that trust on every project. Doesn't matter how small, doesn't matter how big. And I think once you've demonstrated that you understand what goes into their decisions, into their priorities, that gives you that space to maneuver in.
These airport projects often span years. and involve countless moving parts, as you've just explained. Can you share a time when things didn't go quite as planned and how you led through it?
Oh, I think the big story that comes to mind when you ask that question was during COVID. So, you know, 2019, we were well on our way to doing almost 100% of the documentation for a new expansion project we were doing at one of our airports. $600 million program, multiple stakeholders, contractors involved. All the details had been developed, the design we had fallen in love with. And it was May of 2020, I got a call and everything stopped. And when I mean everything stopped, it wasn't that project. Every project we had in our office stopped on one day. And for us, this was, we were sort of hitting our growth peak. And it was a hard call because all of a sudden our biggest project had stopped and all our other projects had stopped. And we were faced with a decision. Do we close our office or do we continue? And I think pretty quickly we knew that within 2 years, work was going to come back. Like there's just so much work that still needs to be done out there. And so we made a call and we said, you know what, we're going to hold the team together. We opened up our financial books to all our team and said, look, this is what we have. We don't know how long this is going to last, but as long as, if you're willing to stick with us through this, we will keep the group whole. We will try to meet everyone, where they are. And so we kept our group intact. A lot of other firms I know, had to furlough, had to make changes. And while that's playing out in teams, the project lost almost $100 million in funding. So all of a sudden, this project that was nearing completion, had to jettison $100 million of cost. When the project restarted, the question became, well, how in the world are we going to redesign an entire expansion and lose $100 million? Well, thankfully, there was one team that was still intact. We were still there. Our team had actually spent time fine-tuning our own tools. And remember earlier in the conversation, I told you about possibilities. One of the things we do as design is we map the space of possibilities. We were able to turn that design around in under a month. But that happened because we had already followed a lot of that process early on. And to me, I think that's the power of the process. It's if you've been diligent about asking questions, you would have anticipated some of the challenges that you were to face. So when this call came, for us, it was like, well, I think we know how to do what we need to do because we already knew the questions, we already knew the constraints, we already knew the possibilities that lay out there. And so it was easy for us to then turn it around and very quickly got buy-in. And so that as the mainline teams came back on board, we were already ready with a design and we were able to pick it up. And there was a lot of really great teamwork and team members that were a part of it. But to me, this is the importance of mapping the space of possibilities. It's not only the decisions you make, but it's the choices you didn't make that also matter, because then that gives you a reserve of ideas you can go back to. You've got plan B, C, D, E, and on, because you've mapped it out. It's not a linear process. You've actually created this space of possibility. And as the constraints come in, you are able to respond quite effectively.
Let's take a quick break. And when we return, we'll get into sustainability, technology, and what it takes to innovate within tight constraints. True transformation starts from within. The Forward Project partners with organizations to create meaningful culture shifts and develop leaders who inspire real change. If your team is ready to move forward with purpose, visit www.theforwardproject.co. You're listening to Expressions of Leadership. I'm Michele Kawamoto Perry, and I'm joined by special guest Daniel Kebede. We've been hearing how Daniel manages complexity and change. Now let's talk about how his team balances big vision with the very real constraints of budget regulations and also sustainability. Sustainability is a big part of your work. Can you share an example of when sustainable design principles have made a project stronger, not just greener?
Aviation is it has a lot of challenges in when we talk about sustainability. And what I mean by that is burning jet fuel has huge impacts and environmental costs that come along with it. And not only that, but jets operate at a high altitude where the carbon that's released from those aircraft have an even bigger impact than carbon that's released at sea level. So because of that, I think as an industry, we've got an even greater responsibility to have a very tight control over how we can be responsible when it comes to using resources, when it comes to the carbon cost of what we do. On the other hand, I fundamentally believe in the importance and value of aviation. I mean, this might be overly optimistic, but I really believe it over the last century, it's been the biggest contributor to global peace because people get to see each other and visit each other and see other worlds and other cultures. And I put a lot of value in that. So within our work, we try to understand what is it that we can do to at least address the constraints of an individual project. What can we do in terms of reducing carbon? What can we do in terms of addressing energy usage? Because airports use a lot of energy. Thankfully, some of the states and we work in, also have very stringent energy requirements. So already that performative requirement is built into the project. So we usually, most of our buildings actually outperform some of the basic standards because it's required by the codes of the areas we work in.
As you point out, leadership in architecture and design often requires balancing vision with constraints like budgets and regulations and timelines. How do you maintain that balance without losing sight of innovation?
Within our design process, we talk about goals and constraints, and both are fundamentally important. Goals are top down. That's vision. That's drive. That's sort of the horizon you go for. Constraints is really what we consider bottom up. It's being diligent about the system level limitations that you have to work with. It can be an aging facility, it can be your budget, it can be your organizational structure, it can be the contracts and agreements you already have in place with airlines or other vendors. But for us, these constraints are actually where we derive creativity from. I think the most daunting thing is a blank sheet of paper because you've got nothing to balance. But when I've got vision that says I want to go here, and I see a set of constraints, it's then the creative part of you kicks in. Like, how do I take this and turn it into that? And that is where we map the space of possibilities between these constraints. Here are the different ways we can achieve those goals. And where you have to be careful is how much weight do I give each constraint? If I weigh it too heavily, then I've not taken advantage of whatever possibilities I have to actually push against that constraint. For example, if I say, our budget is fixed, usually that's a very tight constraint. But there could be a possibility that says, well, yes, this pocket of money is limited, but airports usually have other funding sources that they can access if it aligns with the mission of that budget pool. So there may be a creative way you can actually let those projects support each other. Or you may say, well, this schedule is really important and I can't move this. It's like, okay, but what is causing it? Well, it's because I'm going to have this new airline start at this time. Well, maybe there's a way you can actually go and test if that constraint is true by saying, well, are there other opportunities to realign your gates? Point being, the constraints are important, but they're also important to push against them and see which ones are heavier than others. and not just assume that it's a constraint. So we weigh the possibilities, and that the possibilities then dictate all the different options and routes we can take to achieve that vision. And for me, this idea of taking goals seriously, taking constraints seriously, but then being able to dance between them and figure out that space of possibility, that is where our work lives. And I think, like, for most designers, that is our happy place. It's working between these big goals and with the limitations of the things that you're working with.
And how do you invite the others that you work with to share in this larger vision?
Very carefully. And what I mean by that is everyone has very specific take on a problem, right? A particular perspective. It's very important to not dilute that perspective. But at the same time, you don't want that perspective to dominate to the point where it limits possibilities. So whether it's the airline, the structural engineer, the baggage handling specialist, the concessionaire, the airport management team, everyone has a very unique perspective, and those perspectives are important. But there is room for play within those focus areas. And this goes back to trust. This is why trust is important, because if you establish trust at each of those component levels, it gives you a little bit of latitude. And a little latitude may not seem much, but if you've got 20 different stakeholders and each has given you a little bit of latitude, suddenly the whole thing becomes malleable. And it's incredible how that transformation happens, because it's incremental shifts in each perspective that has made possible what otherwise would not have been possible. So in some way, that trust, that building of trust at a system and component level actually allows you to come up with something completely transformative, but still maintaining, the individual perspective. So that ability to be honest and true to sort of the goals, but at the same time show there is latitude within the constraints. I think that's a very nuanced position. And that's why you have to be careful in terms of how you communicate intent. How do you build trust and maintain trust at every level? That really lets you achieve something that, otherwise people would, and it's happened on interviews, people would turn and say, I did not think that was possible.
What's the key to building that trust?
Empathy. It comes back to empathy. If you tell me, hey, this is my priority, and I can internalize it and say to you, okay, you really care about this because of this reason, and you're like, yes, that's probably the deepest trust, because it means I have internalized your values. I've internalized your priorities. And I think that's again where that human connection comes in and says, okay, I'll give you the benefit of the doubt. But it starts with that humility, that empathy, that ability to say, I see, hear, and understand what you are trying to say.
We're going to take one final break. When we return, we'll look ahead to the future of airports and hear Daniel's wisdom about leadership and a touch of whimsy. We'll be right back. Don't miss a thing. Follow Expressions of Leadership on your favorite podcast app and connect with us on Instagram and YouTube at Expressions of Leadership. Welcome back to Expressions of Leadership. I'm your host, Michele Kawamoto Perry, and we're in our final segment with Daniel Kebede. And I want to look ahead to the airports of tomorrow, the legacy that he wants to leave, and a little leadership wisdom and whimsy to wrap things up. Looking ahead, what's your vision for the future of airports and aviation design?
For me, I think the most transformative thing would be what I would consider point-to-point transportation, meaning you can leave from any airport and land at any other airport across the world. Right now, most of our systems work sort of in a hub and spoke model. You fly into LAX, or you fly into Baltimore, or you fly into DC, and then you fly to an alternate location. And that's good, and that has its place. But I can imagine a time when, aircraft become efficient enough the systems become robust enough that you can really fly from, a smaller airport and, reach far destinations. I think that would open up travel in such an incredible way. I think there'll always be place for the large hub airports, but if you have some AI system that says, "Oh, you know what? I'm realizing there's a whole bunch of people that live in this, part of LA that all want to travel to Chicago." Well, there's no reason why you can have an aircraft, get designated because that market is there. And can you imagine how incredible that would be, where you basically would say, "Hey, I want to go to Chicago over the next couple of weeks. Let me know when something becomes available." And the systems figures out and has, an airline ready, and you're boarded and fly, and you don't have to go to the major hubs. I think there's that sort of interface between large scale data, efficient infrastructure, and how it can all come together, I think is really incredible in terms of what it could mean for aviation and just infrastructure in general.
And what legacy do you hope to leave for your industry, your firm, and those that you mentor?
Now, I think about some of the airports we've worked at per year: 25 million people, 80 million people, 100 million people go through these facilities. That's an incredible amount of impact you can have. And I think aviation in general, sometimes we underestimate how powerful it is and how much of a leverage it can have. I always use this number that at any given time, 3/4 to 1 million people are at 30,000 feet. Think about that. That's a whole city permanently at 30,000 feet. And it has food, it has services, it has its own language, it has its safety officers, it has its rituals. I mean, it's literally a city in the sky. And I think that insight and that sense that you can have this sort of idealized world, I think that's an incredible legacy for aviation. And if we can build it in a way that gives access to the most number of people with the most, diverse of backgrounds, I think it just gets better. So I think for me, that would probably be it as the legacy.
We've now reached our wisdom and whimsy segment of the show, where we get to ask our guest one advice question and one fun question. Let's start with sharing some wisdom. What's the best piece of advice that you've received, and how has it shaped your approach to leadership?
I think probably it was less that I received and one I read. And this, I think this is one that has been referenced in many places, but it comes from Viktor Frankl. And it's between stimulus and response, there's a gap. And in that gap is all of our freedom to be human. And I think to me, that's actually what design is. I talked about constraints and goals, right? Between stimulus, between realizing, okay, this is what's happening, and then how you respond to it, there's that space, right? And that's the space of possibility. That's the space of creativity. That's the space of transformative potential. If we're just reactive, then we're not really living, and we're certainly not living skillfully, because we're just responding, right? We're just at a system level responding. But I think that ability to pause, wait, inject our values, and then transform a situation, I think that is design. To me, that's the core power of design. So if there's a wisdom, it would be that, if whatever that stimulus is, grant yourself that little space of maneuvering, and it's incredible how that can scale in such a way that becomes transformative.
And now for some whimsy. If you could add one purely fun, imaginative feature to an airport, no budget, no regulations, what would it be and why?
Well, if you've got any airport managers that listen to this, I would be very happy to explore this idea with them. So Harry Potter, platform 11 and a half, that where they magically disappear. I think that's so fun. So imagine, now everyone has their, VR devices, right? Or their phones. So imagine if there was a location, you go to an airport and secret location, but when you pull up your phone, it actually shows you a restaurant that others can't see, but it's there. And it has a menu that others can't see, but you can order. And magically, because we do have what are called, funnily enough, we call them ghost kitchens, but you actually have kitchens in airports that are hidden away that serve multiple vendors. So you can have a hidden menu. So how cool would that be if you had sort of like a virtual speakeasy, I guess you can say, where, you can order from this hidden menu, but you first have to know where to look for it. I think that would be fun. I think that would be a nice way of engaging, people, travelers, especially now that, augmented reality is kind of a part of what we do. It's easy enough to offer a whole bunch of creative experiences that way. So I think that would be fun. I think that would be fun to bury some hidden Easter eggs in airports around the country.
I love that idea. I'm totally in. If you make it happen, let me know.
Absolutely.
So, if people in our audience want to learn more about you and Abstract, where should they go?
The best place is going to be our website. It's www.abstract.group. You'll get a sense of some of the work we've done, and I think more importantly, also of some of the things I find inspiring. I think that'll be the best way.
Well, Daniel, thank you so much for joining me today on Expressions of Leadership and sharing your journey and your insights and your vision. You've given us a look at leadership in a space that most of us only see when we're catching a flight. And it's been fascinating to hear how much thought, creativity, and care goes into designing these gateways to the world.
Thank you, Michelle. This was a lot of fun. I appreciate it.
And to our listeners, thank you for spending this time with us. If you took something meaningful away from today's conversation with Daniel, follow, subscribe, and share it with a friend. Until next time, I'm Michele Kawamoto Perry. Keep leading in ways that lift each other. If you haven't done so already, make sure to click on that follow button so you don't miss out on future episodes. Have a guest you'd like us to interview? Questions, ideas, or just want to say hello? You can reach us at letstalk@expressionsofleadership.com or connect with us on Instagram or YouTube. We'd love to hear from you. And as always, thanks to our amazing team behind the scenes for making this podcast possible, including our sound engineer, Graham Palmer, and my chief encourager and advisor, Jeremiah Higgins.